Everybody like and subscribe, praise the bell icon. Story number 1.
It was a typical Friday night, and Sarah had just moved into a small, isolated cottage on the outskirts of town. She loved the idea of living alone, the peace and quiet away from the city noise. Her parents had warned her, of course, about living out there by herself, but she brushed it off. The idea of getting away from the hustle and bustle was too appealing. The first week had been fine. Sarah had spent her evenings reading, cooking, and settling into her new life, but something began to feel off. Every night, right after the clock struck midnight, she heard soft knocks on her door. Not the kind of knocks someone would make if they were trying to get your attention. No, these were almost rhythmic, like they were intentionally paced, deliberate, and slow. At first, she brushed it off as the wind, or maybe a branch scraping against the door, but the sound was too distinct. One night, Sarah decided to confront whatever it was. She grabbed a flashlight, cautiously approached the door, and peered through the peephole. The porch outside was empty. Nothing. She opened the door slowly, half expecting someone to be there, but there was no one in sight. She stepped outside and shone the flashlight around the yard. The beam cut through the dark, illuminating the tall grass and a few scattered rocks, but there was nothing. No one. She stood there for a moment, trying to calm the rising unease in her chest. It must be nothing, she told herself. Maybe some animal was making the noise. But the next night, the knocks came again. Only this time, they were louder and more insistent. Sarah's heart began to race as she listened to the steady rhythm of the knocks echoing through the silence of the night. She waited a few moments, then stood up, too terrified to check the door. Instead, she called the local sheriff, but by the time he arrived, the knocks had stopped. Must have been an animal, the sheriff said, inspecting the door. No sign of forced entry. Maybe you're hearing things, but I'll keep an eye out for you. She nodded, but the dread in her stomach wouldn't go away. The sheriff left, and Sarah spent the next few hours tossing and turning in bed, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling that she was being watched. The following week, Sarah's unease reached a breaking point. It wasn't just the knocks anymore. She began to see strange figures standing outside her windows late at night, just beyond the edge of the porch light. They never moved, just stood there staring. She would freeze, watching them, hoping they'd disappear, but they never did. Then, as quickly as they appeared, they were gone when she blinked or looked away for just a second. On one particularly restless night, Sarah gathered all her courage and decided to leave the cottage. She needed to get away, clear her mind, and maybe find someone who could help. But as she walked to her car, she stopped in her tracks. A figure was standing on her porch, a tall man with a weathered face staring at her with hollow eyes. He didn't say a word, just watched her, and for a moment, it felt as if the air itself had stopped moving. Frozen, Sarah couldn't breathe, couldn't move. The man finally turned and disappeared into the trees. She quickly ran to her car and sped out of there, not knowing what to believe anymore. But she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was always there, just watching from the shadows. She returned a few days later, trying to convince herself that she was overreacting, but when she got back, she found her front door wide open. The house was eerily still. Every room felt like it was suffocating her, the air thick with the sensation of being watched. As she stepped through the door, a chilling thought crept into her mind. What if I never truly left? In the dead of night, as she lay awake in bed, she heard it again. The knocks, soft, deliberate, rhythmically tapping against the door. But this time it wasn't just a knock, it was a voice. "Let me in," it whispered, barely audible but unmistakable. Sarah froze. She wanted to scream, but her voice caught in her throat. She slowly crept out of bed and looked through the peephole. There was nothing, just the dark, empty porch. The knocking stopped, but then her phone vibrated on the nightstand. She reached over, her hand shaking as she picked it up. There was a text message from an unknown number. "I'm here. I've been waiting for you." Sarah's blood ran cold. From that night on, the knocking never stopped.
Story number 2.
It was an ordinary Saturday night when Mark decided to take the back roads home after visiting a friend. The streets were empty, the only sound being the hum of his car engine as he drove deeper into the dense woods. He had taken this route countless times before, but tonight something felt different. The trees loomed overhead like dark sentinels, casting long shadows across the narrow, winding road. It was as though the forest itself had grown unnaturally still, holding its breath. Mark didn't think much of it at first, chalking up the unease to his tiredness. But as he drove further, he started noticing something in the distance, a faint glow through the trees. He squinted, confused. There were no streetlights out here, no houses for miles, so where was that light coming from? Curiosity piqued, Mark turned the wheel, following the faint light as it seemed to beckon him deeper into the woods. After a few minutes of driving, he found himself at the edge of a small clearing. In the center was a dilapidated house. The glow was coming from inside. The house was dark and unsettling, with broken windows and an overgrown yard. Mark's heart began to race. There was no logical reason for a house to be out here, but the light, the glow. He couldn't shake the feeling that it was calling to him. He parked his car a few feet away and stepped out, the air growing colder with each passing second. The only sounds were the crunch of leaves underfoot and the distant rustling of the trees. Mark hesitated for a moment, then walked toward the house. The front door was slightly ajar, as if someone had been expecting him. A cold shiver ran down his spine as he pushed the door open, its hinges creaking loudly. The interior was dark, save for the eerie glow that seemed to emanate from the far corner of the room. Mark's eyes darted around, and that's when he saw it, a figure standing in the shadows, just beyond the light. A woman, tall and impossibly thin, her face obscured by tangled hair. Her eyes glowed faintly, and they locked onto him. Mark's breath hitched as he took a step back, but his feet wouldn't move. The woman stepped forward, her movement jerky and unnatural, as though she were struggling against an invisible force. She was getting closer. Her mouth opened wide, but no sound came out. The air around him grew thick, suffocating, as though the house itself were alive, pulling him deeper into its grip. Just as Mark managed to turn and flee, the door slammed shut behind him with a deafening crash. He pounded on it, but it wouldn't open. Panic set in. He was trapped. He turned back to face the room, and for a brief moment, the woman was gone. But there was something else in the corner now. A figure much taller, its silhouette vaguely human but distorted. Like a shadow given form, a voice whispered from the darkness, barely audible. "You shouldn't have come." Mark's blood ran cold. He knew then that he wasn't alone. Whatever was in that house was not something that could be reasoned with, and it wasn't human. He turned, throwing himself at the door, but it still wouldn't budge. The figure stepped closer, its presence like a wave of icy terror that froze him to the core. Mark could feel the weight of its gaze, and he knew, without a doubt, that he had made a mistake. The last thing he remembered was the faint glow of the woman's eyes, getting closer and closer until everything went black. The next morning, when a search party came through the woods, they found Mark's car abandoned at the edge of the clearing. But the house was gone. No sign of it, just the trees, the overgrown grass, and the silence. As for Mark, his body was never found. But the locals still tell stories about the house in the woods. They say that on certain nights, if you listen closely, you can hear faint whispers and the sound of someone calling your name just beyond the tree line. And if you ever find yourself driving on those back roads at night, don't follow the lights. Whatever's out there isn't looking for company, it's hunting.
Story number 3.
Lena had always been an avid fan of hiking. She found peace in the vastness of the forests, in the way the wind whispered through the trees, and how the world felt far away from the noise of her everyday life. One weekend, she decided to venture into a lesser-known part of the national park, a trail that had been marked as unmaintained and rarely traveled. There was something alluring about it, something that seemed to promise a deeper connection with nature, away from the usual crowd. The first few miles of the hike were uneventful, just the sound of her boots crunching on the dry leaves beneath her feet. The path was narrow, overgrown with brambles and ivy, but Lena didn't mind. She felt like an explorer. As the hours passed, the trail became increasingly more isolated. The trees grew denser, their branches intertwining above her to form a thick canopy. The sun was beginning to dip low in the sky, but she was still far from her destination, a secluded lake that had drawn her here in the first place. As she walked deeper into the woods, a strange feeling began to settle in her stomach. The air felt colder, unnaturally so, and the quietness around her was oppressive. Even the usual sounds of birds and rustling animals seemed to have disappeared. She checked her watch, 5:30 p.m. The sun was setting and she should have turned back by now. But the lake was so close and she didn't want to miss it. She pushed forward, ignoring the unsettling feeling that clawed at the back of her mind. The path seemed to twist in on itself, as though she was walking in circles. The trees around her looked almost wrong, their gnarled branches twisted in unnatural ways. It felt like she was being watched, though she couldn't pinpoint why. Then, as she rounded a bend, she saw something that made her stop in her tracks, a small, dilapidated shack. She hadn't seen any sign of it on the map, and she was certain she hadn't passed it on the trail. The shack stood at the edge of a small clearing, half sunken into the earth, the roof sagging as if it had been abandoned for decades. Curiosity tugged at her, and despite her better judgment, she approached. The door was slightly ajar, the hinges creaking in the stillness. She hesitated, but eventually pushed it open, stepping inside. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of mildew and something sour filled her nose. There was no furniture, just debris scattered across the floor, old, rotting wood, rusted tools, and torn fabric. As she stepped deeper into the shack, she noticed something strange on the far wall, a series of notches carved into the wood. It was hard to make out at first, but then it became clear. The notches were not random. They formed a pattern, almost like a tally. But some of the marks were not just lines. They were shapes, jagged and sharp, almost like crude drawings. Her heart skipped a beat. There were more notches than she could count, stretching across the wall. As she stared at them, her breath caught in her throat. One of the shapes looked like a hand, a human hand, its fingers spread wide, carved into the wood. And just beneath it, a figure that looked like a twisted face. Something was wrong. Something wasn't right with this shack. Just as she turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind her, so hard the walls rattled. She spun around, panic setting in. She ran to the door, but it wouldn't budge. Her hands shook as she pulled at the handle, but the door was locked from the outside. Suddenly, the air around her grew thick, suffocating. A low, guttural whisper filled the room, as though it were coming from the very walls themselves. Lena froze, her mind racing. She was no longer alone. There was something in the shack with her. A sound like soft footsteps echoed behind her, slow and deliberate. Lena turned, her pulse racing, but there was nothing there. The whispering grew louder, then clearer. "Help me, please." Lena's heart hammered in her chest. The voice was faint, almost pleading, but it didn't sound human. She backed away from the corner where the sound seemed to be coming from. But as she moved, the temperature in the room dropped even further. It felt like ice was creeping into her bones. She turned again and saw it, just at the edge of her vision. A figure, dark and distorted, standing in the doorway. Its features were vague, like shadows clinging to a silhouette, but there was something unmistakable about the shape. A face, twisted and inhuman, with hollow, sunken eyes that stared into her soul. The figure stepped forward, and with every step, the whispering grew louder. It was no longer just one voice. Now there were dozens, all pleading, all screaming, all desperate for something. "Let us out," they cried. "Help us." Lena's breath caught in her throat as she backed into the farthest corner of the shack, her hands desperately searching for an escape. The figure inched closer, and its dark, jagged hand reached out, its fingers elongating as if they were meant to grab her. With a strength she didn't know she had, Lena finally managed to break free, her body slamming against the door. It gave way with a deafening crack. She stumbled out into the clearing, gasping for air, her heart pounding in her chest. She ran as fast as her legs could carry her, not looking back until she reached the trail again. The sun had fully set by now, and the forest was pitch black. The path seemed to stretch on forever, but Lena didn't stop. She couldn't. She wasn't sure how long she ran, but when she finally stumbled back to her car, breathless and shaking, she didn't look at the woods again. That night, Lena drove back to the park entrance, her mind racing. She kept hearing the whispers, soft and distant, like they were still following her. And every time she closed her eyes, she saw the shadowy figure standing just behind her, its hollow eyes staring right into her. The next morning, she returned to the park ranger station, hoping to find someone who could explain what she had encountered. But when she told them about the shack, their faces paled. They told her there was no shack on the map, no record of any building in that part of the woods. And when she asked about the marks on the wall, the ranger went pale. "That place," he said, his voice trembling, "hasn't been touched for decades. There's a reason the trail's marked unmaintained. You're not the first one to get lost out there. But you might be the last." Lena never went back to those woods, but the whispers still follow her wherever she goes.
Story number 4.
Max had always been drawn to the thrill of the unknown, the eerie feeling that came with exploring abandoned places. So when he and his friends heard about an old, forsaken mansion at the edge of town, they couldn't resist. The mansion, known as the Wraithwood House, had stood empty for over 50 years, its dark history shrouded in rumors. It was said that once you entered, you could never leave the same. The house was perched on a hill, surrounded by thick, twisted trees that seemed to reach for the sky like skeletal fingers. Max and his friends had heard strange stories about it: disappearances, strange noises, and lights flickering in the windows at night. But none of that deterred them. They saw it as an adventure, a chance to make memories that would last forever. They arrived at the mansion just as the sun was setting, casting long, stretching shadows across the grounds. The mansion loomed ahead, its broken windows staring out like eyes, its roof caved in from years of neglect. The front gate creaked open as if inviting them in, and with an air of excited trepidation, they stepped onto the overgrown path leading to the front door. The door, strangely enough, was ajar. Max hesitated but pushed it open. The air inside the house was cold, almost unnatural, and the smell of decay hit them immediately. Mold, rotting wood, and something else, something sour, like damp earth. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, and the floor creaked beneath their feet. They explored room after room, each one more decayed than the last. But it wasn't just the physical deterioration that unnerved them. The atmosphere was heavy, as if the house itself was alive, watching their every move. And as they ventured deeper into the mansion, the strange feeling that they were not alone began to settle in their chests. Max, feeling braver than his friends, decided to venture into the basement. He descended the creaking stairs, his flashlight beam cutting through the inky blackness. The air grew colder, and the silence became oppressive, so thick that it felt like the house was holding its breath. Max's footsteps echoed off the stone walls, and then he heard something else, a low guttural sound, almost like a whisper, but not quite. He stopped, his heart pounding in his chest. The whispering was coming from behind him, but when he turned, there was nothing there. He shook his head, trying to rationalize it, but the whispers grew louder, more urgent, as if they were calling him. With his breath catching in his throat, Max took another step. That's when he saw it. A door at the far end of the basement, slightly cracked open, with a faint glow spilling from the gap. Curiosity overcame him, and he approached it slowly, every step feeling like it was pulling him deeper into something he couldn't escape. When he pushed the door open, he was met with an overwhelming sense of dread. The room was filled with dust and cobwebs, but in the center, on a pedestal, was an old wooden box. It wasn't large, but it was intricately carved with symbols that Max didn't recognize. The glow seemed to be emanating from within the box, though no light source was visible. The whispers became deafening, now unmistakably voices, though they were distant, echoing from the walls around him. Max could hear his name. "Max, come closer." He reached out for the box, his fingers trembling, and just as they brushed the surface, the whispers ceased. The air grew still, and then a low, mechanical sound filled the room. It was the creaking of the floorboards, but not his. No, these footsteps were different, heavy, deliberate, and they were coming closer. Max spun around, his flashlight trembling in his hand. At the far end of the room stood a figure, tall, draped in tattered clothing, its face obscured by shadows. It moved slowly toward him, its head cocked to one side as if studying him, its footsteps dragging on the cold stone floor. The air seemed to grow even colder as it took another step forward. Max's heart raced. He tried to move, but his legs wouldn't respond. He was frozen in place. The figure came closer, and its presence was suffocating. It reached out with a long, bony hand, its fingers long and twisted, and Max couldn't breathe. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure stopped. The whispers started again, louder this time, and the door slammed shut behind him with a violent crash. Max turned around, now desperate to escape. The room was spinning, the walls pressing in on him. He rushed for the door, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't open it. The handle wouldn't turn. Panicked, he backed away, and that's when he heard the voice, clear, direct, and unmistakable. "Leave while you still can." Max's body shook with terror. He scrambled for a way out, but there was no escape. The figure was still there watching him, its hollow eyes following his every movement. The next thing Max remembered was waking up outside the mansion, lying on the cold ground. The sun was up and the house was silent. The air around him was calm, but the chill still clung to his skin. He could hear nothing. No whispers, no footsteps, nothing. Max never spoke of that night again. He couldn't. The mansion was gone, or at least it seemed to be. No one else could ever find it. The townspeople dismissed his story as a wild fantasy, a trick of the mind. But every now and then, Max would feel that same suffocating presence following him, an unseen watcher, waiting. And sometimes when he would lay in bed at night, he would hear the faintest whisper, too faint to be certain, but enough to send a chill down his spine. "Max, you shouldn't have opened the box." No matter how hard he tried, he could never escape the house. The mansion's curse was always with him.
Story number 5.
Lily had always thought she was immune to fear. Growing up, she devoured horror books and films, enjoyed the adrenaline of haunted house attractions, and even stayed alone in old, creaky houses without a second thought. So, when her friend Jenna invited her to a weekend getaway at a secluded cabin deep in the woods, Lily didn't hesitate. It was the perfect opportunity to get away from the stress of work and enjoy some quiet time with friends. The cabin was nestled in a quiet valley, surrounded by thick forest, miles away from the nearest town. The air was crisp, the kind of fresh you could only find deep in the woods, and the only sounds were the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional chirp of a distant bird. It was peaceful, almost idyllic. The first night was calm. They settled in, played board games, cooked a big dinner, and sat by the fire. But as the evening wore on, the atmosphere began to change. The air grew heavier, as if something was pressing in on them. It was subtle at first. Little things like the way the wind seemed to grow quieter, or how the flickering of the firelight would catch in odd ways, casting long, stretching shadows on the walls. Lily felt a sense of unease creeping in, but she brushed it off. She wasn't one to get spooked by mere shadows. Jenna, however, seemed increasingly tense, frequently glancing over her shoulder and fidgeting with the hem of her sweater. When Lily asked if she was okay, Jenna just laughed nervously and said she was fine. The unease continued to build over the next few hours, but Lily decided to ignore it and head to bed. She was the last one to retire to her room, and as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Her eyes kept darting toward the corner of the room, where the shadows seemed darker than the rest. Every little creak of the cabin seemed amplified, like someone was moving around. Then she heard it, the sound of soft footsteps in the hall outside her room. They were slow, deliberate, and far too close for comfort. Lily's breath caught in her throat. She held still, listening, her heart pounding in her ears. The footsteps came closer, stopping just outside her door. Then they started again, moving away from her room, fading into the silence. She convinced herself it was just the house settling, though something deep inside her told her it wasn't. After a few more minutes of lying awake, trying to calm herself, she finally fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, Lily woke up to find Jenna sitting at the kitchen table, looking pale and exhausted. She had dark circles under her eyes, and her usually bright demeanor was gone. Lily tried to brush it off as just a bad night's sleep, but the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted again. It was heavier, more oppressive. Over breakfast, Jenna finally spoke up. "Lily, I need to tell you something." Lily looked at her curiously, waiting for her to continue. "I don't think we should be here," Jenna said quietly, her voice trembling. "Last night after you went to bed, I heard someone whispering. I thought it was just in my head at first, but it was real. I'm sure of it. I heard footsteps in the hall too. And then I saw something in the window. Lily frowned. What did you see? Jenna swallowed hard. It was a face pressed up against the window. I couldn't see its features, but I know it was there. It was watching me, and when I went to the window to look outside, there was no one there. Lily's stomach dropped. She couldn't explain the feeling in the pit of her stomach, but it was like an electric shock that traveled through her spine. It was a feeling of something being wrong, something far darker than just a creaky cabin. What do you think it was? Lily asked, though she wasn't sure if she wanted to know. Jenna shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. I don't know, but I don't want to stay here anymore. Lily tried to dismiss it, to convince herself that they were just overreacting. But when they stepped outside for a walk, things only got stranger. As they ventured deeper into the woods, they felt as though they were being led in a specific direction, drawn towards something. The trees felt too close, their branches like arms reaching out to trap them. They could hear faint whispers on the wind, too soft to make out the words, but there was no mistaking the tone. It was unnatural, otherworldly. They stumbled upon an old, crumbling well, hidden deep in the woods, surrounded by overgrown ivy and moss. The stones around the well were slick with age and dampness. A chill ran down Lily's spine as she approached it. Jenna seemed reluctant to get any closer, her face pale. Lily, I don't think we should be here, she whispered, her voice shaky. Let's go back. But Lily was already too close. She could feel a pull, like the well was calling her. She peered over the edge and into the darkness below, but there was no bottom. It was just an abyss. And then, just as she was about to turn away, she saw something moving in the blackness. A hand, pale and thin, reached up from the darkness. It was long, bony, and unnaturally stretched. It clawed at the air, as though trying to escape. Lily stepped back in shock, but the hand followed her movement, stretching toward her. Terrified, she grabbed Jenna's arm, yanking her away from the well. They ran back to the cabin, but as they neared the porch, they heard it, the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps behind them. They turned around, but the woods were empty. The whispering grew louder, more frantic, as if something was chasing them, urging them to turn back, to face whatever was following them. By the time they made it back inside, the house was colder than before. And then, the whispers came again, clearer now, louder than before, filling the cabin. Leave. Leave now. In a panic, they packed their bags and fled, not daring to look back. As they drove away, the woods behind them seemed to watch, the trees swaying unnaturally, like they were alive, like they were trying to reach for them. When they looked in the rearview mirror, the cabin was gone. Not a trace of it remained, as though it had never been there at all. But the whispers lingered in their minds long after they left the woods. And when Lily closed her eyes that night, she could still hear them, soft and insistent, calling from the darkness, "Come back, it's waiting." They never spoke of the cabin again, but they both knew that whatever had followed them was not done. It was still waiting.
Story number 6.
It was a quiet Thursday evening when Anna decided to stay late at the office, trying to finish up some work before the weekend. The building was mostly empty, with just a few other employees scattered throughout the floors, but it was close to midnight, and she was the last one left on her floor. Her office was on the top floor, and the hum of the fluorescent lights above her created a strange, almost eerie ambience in the otherwise silent building. She had just closed her laptop when she heard a noise, a soft thud coming from the hallway. Anna paused, her heart beating a little faster. She was sure the building was empty. No one else should have been on her floor. The sound came again, a faint scrape against the floor, followed by the slow, deliberate sound of footsteps. At first, Anna thought it was just the building settling, the kind of creaks and groans that came with an old structure like this. But the footsteps continued, growing closer, step by step, until they stopped just outside her office door. Anna's stomach twisted. She was frozen, staring at the door, wondering if she should check. It could be someone else still working late, or maybe just a janitor passing by. But something about the way the footsteps had moved, slow and measured, unnerved her. She stood up, her legs shaking slightly, and quietly approached the door. When she opened it, the hallway was empty. The fluorescent lights flickered above, casting long shadows that stretched across the floor. No one was in sight. Anna's mind raced. She had clearly heard the footsteps, but there was no one there. She stepped into the hallway, looking left and right, but the area was still. Her phone rang suddenly, the sharp tone breaking the silence. Anna jumped, startled. She answered quickly, relieved to hear the familiar voice of her best friend, Rachel. "Hey, Anna, you still at work?" Rachel asked, her voice light. "Yeah, just finishing up some things. It's so quiet here, though. I swear, I heard someone outside my office door." Rachel's voice dropped a little. "You know, that building is old, right? It's been here since the 1920s. They say it's haunted, that some people have heard weird things late at night." Anna laughed nervously. "Ha, yeah. I'm sure it's just my imagination. I've been here late a few times, and nothing like this has ever happened." "You sure you're okay? Don't stay too late, all right? It's getting creepy." Anna hung up, feeling a little unsettled, but tried to shake it off. She returned to her office, closing the door behind her, and tried to focus on her work again. But she couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that something was off. It was then that she noticed it, an envelope on her desk. It was plain white, with no writing on it, just sitting there in the middle of her desk. She was sure she hadn't left it there, and she couldn't recall anyone else coming in. Her heart skipped a beat as she hesitated, staring at it. She opened the envelope, revealing a single, crisp sheet of paper. The handwriting was unfamiliar, written in an elegant, looping script. "Leave now, Anna." Her blood ran cold. Who could have left this? And how did they know her name? Before she could process what was happening, the lights in the office flickered violently, and the temperature seemed to drop several degrees. The air turned heavy, oppressive, like something was standing just behind her. She spun around, but there was no one there. The lights flickered again, this time going out completely, plunging her office into darkness. The only sound was the pounding of her own heart in her chest. Anna fumbled for her phone, using its screen as a makeshift flashlight, but when she turned it on, the dim light revealed something that made her blood run cold. The door to her office, which she had clearly closed earlier, was slowly creaking open. Her breath caught in her throat as she backed away from the door, pressing herself against the desk. She hadn't opened it. She was certain. The door was now half ajar, just enough to reveal a shadow standing in the doorway. The silhouette was tall, too tall for any normal person, and it was moving toward her, its form blurry and distorted in the low light. Anna's heart raced as she scrambled to stand, but her legs felt like they were made of lead. She couldn't move. The figure in the doorway took another step forward, and the shadows around it seemed to stretch unnaturally, almost as if they were alive. It was wearing something dark, but its face was hidden, shrouded in shadow. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, leaving nothing but silence and darkness in its wake. The lights flickered back on, illuminating her office once more. The door was now fully open and the hallway outside was empty. But Anna's gaze fell to the desk in front of her, and her breath caught again. The paper she had found earlier, the one that said, "Leave now, Anna," was now crumpled up in a ball, sitting neatly in the center of the desk, as if someone had placed it there after tossing it aside. Anna couldn't process what was happening. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of it, but all she could do was grab her things in a frantic haste and run toward the elevator. The building seemed to stretch and warp around her as she rushed through the empty hallways, the silence now unbearable. When the elevator doors finally opened, she stepped inside and slammed the button for the ground floor. But as the doors closed, she caught a glimpse of something in the reflection, a pale face staring back at her from the shadows of the hallway. The elevator descended, but as it did, Anna couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been watching her was still there, lurking in the corners of the building, waiting. And though she never spoke about it to anyone, she would never forget that night. Because every time she found herself working late, no matter where she was, she felt that presence just behind her, watching, waiting. And in the stillness of the night, she swore she could sometimes hear the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, following her wherever she went.
Story number 7.
Tom had never believed in the supernatural. Growing up in a small town, he was practical, grounded, and skeptical of anything that couldn't be explained by science or logic. He worked as a mechanic, spending his days in the grease and oil of car engines and his nights watching TV or reading. That was until he moved into a new apartment on the outskirts of town, far from his old life. The rent was cheap, the place was quiet, and it seemed perfect for a fresh start. The apartment was a small, one-bedroom unit on the second floor of an old building, which was slowly falling into disrepair. The hallway was narrow, the walls peeling, and the floor creaked with every step. The landlord, a grumpy older man, didn't say much when Tom moved in, just handed him the keys and told him to lock the door when he left. Nothing unusual, just a bit of a strange vibe. Tom didn't think much of it. He was used to the solitude and didn't mind the quiet. The first night was uneventful, but after that, strange things began happening. It started small, lights flickering in the hallway at night, strange sounds coming from the apartment above him, like furniture being dragged across the floor or something heavy being dropped. At first, he ignored it. Old buildings made noises, especially at night. But over the course of the next week, the noises grew louder, more deliberate. One night, while watching TV, Tom heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps outside his door. He froze. Someone was in the hallway. He got up and checked, but there was no one there. The hall was empty, dimly lit, just like it always was. His door was still locked. He shook his head, trying to convince himself it was just his imagination playing tricks on him. The next night, the same thing happened. Footsteps, slow and heavy, dragging along the floor outside his door. Again, no one was there. The third night was when things took a darker turn. Tom was in the kitchen, making a late-night snack, when he heard the sound of tapping on the bathroom window. It was rhythmic, almost like someone was knocking on it. He glanced toward the window, his stomach tightening, but the blinds were drawn. Slowly, he moved toward the window and pulled them open. Nothing. He checked the alley below, but it was empty, silent, as though the world had fallen asleep. Shaking his head, he went back to his snack, brushing it off as nothing more than the wind or his mind playing tricks on him. The tapping continued the next night, but this time it was louder, urgent. And when Tom went to check, the blinds weren't drawn. They were wide open. He felt a chill run down his spine as he peered outside, but again there was nothing there. No sign of anyone, no movement, just the empty, silent street. The strange feeling in the pit of his stomach wouldn't go away, and he couldn't shake the sensation that he was being watched. That night, he stayed up late, sitting on the couch, trying to keep his mind occupied. But the longer he stayed awake, the more the strange events seemed to escalate. The floor creaked. Then the sound of breathing, soft, labored, as if someone was standing just outside his door. Tom stood up, heart racing. He was done ignoring it. He opened the door and stepped into the hallway, but there was no one there. The building was silent. But as he turned to go back inside his apartment, something caught his eye. A shadow, a dark shape, moving along the edge of the hallway. It was tall, thin, and inhuman. The shape was tall enough to reach the ceiling, its limbs stretching unnaturally. Tom's blood ran cold as it seemed to slither from one dark corner to another, moving like liquid darkness, and then it disappeared into the wall. Tom ran back into his apartment, slamming the door behind him. His mind was racing, heart pounding. What had he just seen? Was he losing his mind? He tried to convince himself it was a trick of the light, but deep down, he knew it wasn't. He wasn't sure how long he sat there, shaking, trying to process what had just happened. But in the silence, he heard something else. A whisper, faint and distant, but unmistakable. Leave. The voice was calm, almost comforting, but the warning was clear. It wasn't his mind. It wasn't a trick. Someone or something was trying to warn him. He didn't wait any longer. Tom grabbed his keys and phone, but when he tried to open the door, it wouldn't budge. The lock was stuck, refusing to turn. Panic surged in his chest. He yanked at the door, but it didn't move. He pulled harder, his palms slick with sweat. That's when he heard it again. A slow, deliberate dragging sound. Something or someone was coming closer, moving down the hall toward his door. Tom's breath caught in his throat as the dragging grew louder, closer, closer, until it stopped right outside his apartment. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from his landlord. The text read, "The building is old. Don't go into the attic. Ever." Tom froze, staring at the message, his blood running cold. He had never seen an attic in the apartment, but now, in the silence, he realized he hadn't checked the apartment thoroughly when he moved in. The thought of an attic unsettled him. Then the door to his bedroom creaked open, though he was sure he hadn't opened it. Something was inside. Tom's heart was pounding in his chest, his body trembling with fear, but he had to know. Slowly, cautiously, he moved toward the bedroom. His mind raced as he pushed the door open, the hinges protesting with an eerie squeal. The room was empty, but there in the corner on the floor near the closet was a trapdoor. He had never noticed it before. His instincts screamed at him to leave, to run as fast as he could, but something compelled him to open it. As his hand gripped the handle, he hesitated for just a second. Then, with a swift motion, he pulled it open. The space below was dark, pitch black, and at the very edge of his vision, he saw movement. A shape slithering, dragging itself along the floor toward him. A voice, cold and hollow, echoed from the depths below. "Come down." The trapdoor slammed shut. Tom never stayed in that apartment again. He moved out the next morning, but whenever he passed the building, he swore he saw a shadow in the window, a tall, dark figure watching him. And sometimes in the dead of night, he could still hear that soft, dragging sound just outside his door.